What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making an old rowing boat, so let's just dive into it. Alright, so to start things off we're going to select a cylinder and I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees so it's horizontal, and then I'm going to increase those subdivisions to 24. Now if I could go back I would probably increase that number a little bit more. It's just going to be the amount of panels that are on the side of your boat. So I just went with 24, and then let's chop it in half so we can create the bottom hull. So all I'm going to do is add 5 edge loops in the middle, and then I'm going to start scaling all of these vertices so I can start getting it into more of a shape of a boat hull. Now the very front of it I'm going to scale it nice and skinny, and then using that target weld tool I can merge together all of those vertices. And then I can start giving this hull just a little bit of shape. So let's play around with these vertices a little bit so I can make it look a little bit more like a boat hull. I'm then going to just select all of those back faces on the back of the hull, and then I can just extract them from the model so I can separate them from the geometry. That way I can treat this like a separate piece of wood, like it's separated from the hull. And I'm going to keep all of these pieces one-sided for now, and then later on, once they get more in their finalized shape, I can then add a little bit of thickness to it. So let's just continue playing around with these vertices so we can make it look a little bit more like a boat hull. Next I'm going to give that middle edge that goes all the way down from the tip to the back of the hull just a small bevel. That way when I hit 3 on my keyboard and smooth it out, it retains that harder edge around where the middle of the hull is. Next we're going to take that back panel we extracted from our geometry, and we're just going to take all of those faces and extrude them just to give them a little bit of thickness. Then afterwards I can go in and clean up the topology a little bit to make it look a little bit more clean. And all I'm doing for this is just deleting all of those faces, and then I can go in with the append to polygon tool and I can reattach all of those edges so I have some cleaner topology. And once again, trying to always keep it 4 sides. Triangles are okay, but 4-sided faces are ideal. Alright, so the hull is slowly coming together, and I just noticed how the front of the hull is usually more tapered in and a little more narrow. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to select those edges and slowly scale them in a little bit so it slowly tapers in and gets a little bit more narrow as it goes towards the front of the boat. Alright, so next up is creating that little piece of wood that runs along the middle of the hull. So to do that, I'm going to create a small cube, and I can start extruding one of the sides so I can start shaping it around my hull. And once again, I'm going to hit 3 on my keyboard as I'm creating the shape so I can see it smoothed out to make sure it's fitting nicely around my hull. And I don't really know exactly how I want this hull to look. I have a few different reference images from Google that I'm looking at, but I was more experimenting along the way, so I'm just going to continue playing around with the shape until I get it into a state that I'm happy with. Alright, so that middle piece of wood is looking better now, so now we can give our hull a little bit of thickness. So to do that, I'm going to select all of those spaces, extrude them to give them a little bit of thickness, and then I can give those top edges a little bevel, that way when I hit 3 on my keyboard, it can retain that shape. Alright, so our hull is looking good. Now we can move on to the top trim, or a little edge that runs on the top of the hull. So to do that, we're going to select a cube, scale that nice and small, and once again I'm going to start extruding one of the sides to start shaping it around my hull. Now to make my life a little bit easier, I'm just going to do one side, and once I'm happy with the shape, I can just duplicate it over to create the other side and then merge them together. So let's just continue playing around with the shape so we can fit it on the top of our hull. Alright, so next up is a little metal piece that's on the front of the boat. I think it just helps hold the hull together, so we're just going to create another cube, scale that nice and small, and position that right at the front of our boat. Alright, so next up is creating all of the seats. Now that's pretty straightforward, it's just a bunch of rectangles. So we're going to create another cube, scale that nice and small, and start positioning them inside of our boat hull. Alright, so now that the seats are in place, I'm just going to play around with the shape a little bit more just to finalize it before moving on to a few other things. Alright, so the boat's looking much better. Now, you could probably just leave this as is if you wanted a lower poly model, and you don't have to necessarily separate all of these side panels that I'm going to do in the next step. You could just add some cool panel texture right in Substance Painter. That way you can have a model that's much smaller in polys. Now for this video, I just wanted to create a little bit of a higher poly model, so in this case, I'm going to separate all of those panels. So at the very beginning of the video when we were deciding how many subdivisions we wanted our cylinder to have, well those were just how many side panels we wanted to have on our boat. Because we chose 24, we have 5 panels or so on each side, so what I'm going to do is just highlight all of those faces on each side of the boat, and I can extract them from the model. That way I'm going to separate all of these different pieces of wood, and then I can start reattaching them and beveling out all of those edges. That way it's going to look like each individual long piece of wood is separated, and it's just going to look a little bit better once we start applying some textures. So let's go ahead and start highlighting all of these faces and separating them from the model so we can create our separate pieces of wood. And then once they're separated, all I'm doing here is just selecting all of those edges and then bridging them back together. And because I gave those edges a small bevel, once I hit 3 on my keyboard, it just retains that shape and that object looks nice and smooth. So let's continue and just repeat these same steps for all of the other panels that we separated, and then we can finish up our hull. Alright, so all of those side panels are done and the hull is looking good. Next up is just that back panel on the back of the boat. So all I'm going to do is just bevel out some of those edges so I can smooth it out. Now I wasn't paying attention and I ended up moving a couple of these polys around without noticing, so I have to spend a little bit longer than usual just cleaning up this shape. So I'm just going to speed up so you just don't have to watch me clean up all of those mistakes I made. So let's go ahead and just finish up this last shape and then the hull is all wrapped up. Alright, so I finally wrapped up that back piece on my hull, and the main hull shape is complete. So next up is just moving on to the frame that's holding all of these boards together. Now that's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to basically create one, and then we can duplicate a bunch to create all the other ones. So I'm going to start off with a cube and then start just shaping it around the inside of my hull. And once again, I'm just going to work on one side, and once I'm happy with that shape, I can duplicate it to flip it over to the other and then reattach them to create that one main frame shape. Alright, so now that I duplicated that same frame over a bunch of times and I have all of my frames, I just need to scale each individual one to fit inside of my boat. So let's just continue on and play around with these frame shapes, and then we can wrap up this hull. so our hull is complete. Next up is doing the floor. And that's pretty straightforward. Once again, we're going to start off with a cube, and I'm going to scale that into a rectangle and start positioning a few of those on the bottom of my boat. Now, I'm not going to worry exactly what's holding this floor up. It's technically going to be just floating in the air, but you're not going to see any of that, so we're not going to worry about it. So let's go ahead and start creating all of these floor panels so we can start positioning them inside of our boat hull. Alright, so next up, I'm just going to take those seats we created earlier, those little wooden benches, and I'm going to start positioning those inside of those frames on my hull. And once those are between those frames, I can create another small cube to act as some little piece of wood that's helping hold that bench or seat in place. Once that piece is in place, I can start beveling out some of these edges so these benches can look a little bit smoother. So let's go ahead and wrap up these seats, and then we can move on to some of the objects on the boat. Alright, so our boat hull's looking good. Now we just need to give it a little bit more love. As you can see, we went really quick with those frames, so they're poking out the sides. So I'm going to spend the next little bit, I'm just going to speed it up as I'm just adjusting a few of these wood panels so they're not poking through the sides of my boat. Alright, so things are looking much better. Let's continue on. There's a few small things I decided to add to my hull just before we wrapped everything up. And I just wanted to add one extra piece of wood that runs around that top rim or edge on my hull. So I'm just going to take that top one we already created, I'm going to duplicate that over and scale that just below it. and then we can start fitting that into those frames just to act as if some extra frame piece is helping hold that hull together. And the only reason I'm doing this, I just thought it would look a little bit more interesting with a few extra wood pieces on that hull. Alright, so finally our hull is complete and it's looking much better. Now we're going to come back once again just because I never know when to quit, and I decided to add one extra small thing to the hull, but for now it's looking good, so let's move on to those side pieces that are holding those paddles. Because this is a paddle boat, it needs those little metal pieces on the side that you can put those paddles into that help, basically makes you row the boat. So that's pretty straightforward. For the little piece that's attached to the boat itself, that's just a little cube. We're going to scale that to fit on that little railing, and then we can add 2 edge loops and just extrude that top face to give it a little shape, like a little rectangle shape. And then once I'm happy with that shape, I can go ahead and bevel out all of those edges. And then for the top piece that the paddle actually sits on, we're going to do that with a half of a cylinder. So similar to how we did the hull, we're just going to start with a cylinder and chop it in half, and then I can shape out that top piece from that little cylinder, and then I can extrude that to give it a little bit of thickness. So let's go ahead and wrap up these little metal pieces, and then we can move on to a few other objects. Alright, so next up was creating a little life ring. Now I needed something to attach this to, so before we do that I'm going to create a little cube to create some little wood piece that's going to sit on the side of my boat that basically this life ring is attached to. So let's first create this little wood piece and then we can move on to the life ring itself. Alright, so next was the life ring, and for that we're going to use a polygon torus, and I'm just going to adjust those sliders and scale that object down to fit inside of our boat. Now I don't know the proper dimensions or width of these life rings, so I'm just going to eyeball it and just generalize how that shape looks. Alright, so next up is creating a little piece of rope that's tied to our life ring. So I'm going to do that with a sweep mesh. So I'm going to start off by creating an EP curve tool, and I can draw the points in the line of roughly the shape of my rope. And then I can start adjusting and moving all of those vertices I created from that line just to fit around my life ring where I want that rope shape to go. And then once I'm happy with that, I can then turn that into a sweep mesh and adjust those sliders to give it a certain amount of thickness depending on how thick I want that rope to be. And then we can wrap up that small piece of rope. Alright, so our life ring is in place and it's looking good, so we can move on to our next object, which is the paddle. So to do this, I'm going to create a cube, and we can start scaling out that cube to look like the bottom piece of my paddle, where the blade is. I think they call it a blade, but either way it's the bottom of the paddle. And then once I'm happy with that shape, I can add a few edge loops in the middle, so then I can use a circularized tool to create a circle on one end of that shape. And then all I have to do is just extrude that circle so I have a nice rounded out handle, and I can just scale that out depending on how big I want that paddle to be. So let's go ahead and start playing around with the shape so we can create a little paddle for our boat. Alright, so the paddles are in place. Next up, I wanted to create a little wood piece that ran around the top edge of my hull. Basically, just on the inside of my hull, I want to have a little wood piece that I could have some buoys that were attached to or tied to. So to do this, I'm just going to reuse that same shape we already created, that top edge or rim on our hull, and then I can just scale that in nice and small and make it a little bit skinnier to fit as that little piece of wood that runs right around my rim of my boat. Alright, so that piece is finally looking good. I just had to tweak it around a little bit until I was happy with it. But now it's nice and thin. Now I can't have it just floating in the air, so I need to create some little piece of wood that it basically attaches to. So I'm going to create another small little cube, and we can scale that out to act as some little piece of wood that's attaching that little new rim piece we created to the side of my hull. Alright, so I thought just to make this piece a little bit more interesting to look at, I thought it'd be cool if one of those little side pieces that hold the paddles was just basically out of place and sitting on that back bench. So to do that, I'm just gonna basically take that side shape and just move it out of place. But I'm gonna keep that little cylinder right in the middle so I know where to boolean out a small hole. Now, to make this look a little bit realistic, it needs to have a little hole that this piece can slide into. If you didn't want to add some extra polys, you could just draw a little black circle on top and act as if there's a hole there, but we want to boolean out a small hole. So I'm going to create a low poly cylinder, and then like I said, keeping this low polys, we can boolean out a small hole. Once that boolean is created, I can use that multi-cut tool just to attach all of those vertices, and then I can bevel out that small edge so once I hit 3 on my keyboard, I have a nice booleaned out hole that's into that little piece of geometry. And then afterwards I can position that little tiny metal piece on that back bench so it looks like it's just out of place and somebody moved it. Alright, so next up is creating those buoys themselves. Now I didn't exactly know how I wanted to go about this, but what I decided to do was create a sphere as the main buoy shape itself. And then I selected all of those top faces and extracted them from the model. This main buoy shape has a really strange top piece to it. It's like a little hat that sits on top that has a little hole into it that rope can go into. So what I thought would work is if I just use a cylinder to create that little hole piece that the rope can go through, and then I can merge that together with the top cutoff piece for my sphere. So that's exactly what I did. I took a cylinder and scaled that nice and small, and I just increased the caps so I could have a nice little hole that ran through it. And then I took that extracted piece from my sphere and I just deleted some of those faces. Now all I had to do was make sure that the amount of faces or edges on the top of my extracted piece matched the exact same amount of edges or faces on the bottom of my cylinder. As long as those two shapes had the same amount of faces, I could just combine those two shapes together and then bridge those two edges so there was one shape. Now there's definitely a few different ways you could have tackled this shape. This is just what I decided to do. Now it took a little bit longer than I originally planned, so I just had to play around with it a little bit until I got it into a position that I was happy with. This is definitely one of those shapes that looks pretty awful for a while, but the more you play around with it, the better it looks. So let's just continue playing around with this shape until I get a nice little buoy object. Alright, so that buoy is finally complete. Now we can scale that down and position that on the side of our boat. So next up is just creating a little piece of rope so this buoy is not floating in the air and it's actually tied to the boat. So very similar to how we did the other one that's holding our little life ring, we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to create a little EP curve tool, draw out those points into the position of a rope, and then I can start positioning those points all around my object so I can then turn that into a sweep mesh to create my rope shape. So let's go ahead and create a little rope for my buoy. And once that line is in place, I can go ahead and turn that into a sweep mesh to create my rope. Now I want this to fit a little bit more snug to my hull, so rather than just messing around with these points over and over again, I'm just going to use my soft select brush by hitting B on my keyboard, and then I can slightly modify this rope so it fits a little bit more snug to our hull. And once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can go ahead and start duplicating this to position all my other buoys around my boat. Now, I would recommend just UVing this ahead of time, just to save a little bit of time in this video. I'm not going to do that, but it would just save you time down the road so you don't have to come back and then reposition all these buoys. Alright, so all those buoys are positioned. Now let's just go tweak a few things in my boat before we start adding a few other things. Alright, so next up was adding a little bit more rope to the boat. I wanted to have a little bit of rope hanging over the edge and kind of going over the bench, just to add a little bit more chaos to the boat to make it look a little bit more busy. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing as I've been doing for all the other ropes in my scene. I'm going to create them with an EP curve tool, and once I'm happy with the position, I can turn those into a sweep mesh. Now if I could go back and redo some stuff, I would add a lot more rope to this model. I would have added some like bunched up rope in the corner, maybe a lot more hanging over the edges. Now, like usual, I try to spend only 2 hours in real-time modeling just for the sake of the video so I don't upload a crazy long video to YouTube. So I ended up only adding one small rope to the scene, but that's definitely one area that I would go back and add a little bit more detail, is just adding a lot more rope, just making it look a little bit more busy, a little bit more chaotic. I feel like it would just add a lot to the model. So I would just recommend doing that if anyone's going to recreate this. So anyways, back to the rope. Let's just start positioning these points until I get it into a shape that I'm happy with. Alright, so our boat model's looking good, and it's basically complete. We just have to add some large netting that I wanted to add to the scene, and I think that's our last object. So to do this, I thought I would use end cloth. Now in the past I've had some weird issues while using end cloth with collisions, so just to avoid any possible problems, I decided just to take all of the main objects in my scene, like the hull and the panels and the seats, and I just quickly duplicated them and grouped them together so I can create a collision object for my mesh. Now all I'm doing is just selecting all of the main objects in my scene, just whatever I want to interact with my cloth material when I drop it out of the air. So once I group those together, I can merge them into one object. And then for the cloth itself, I'm going to do that with a plane, but I'm just going to make sure to crank up those subdivisions, so I'm going to increase those to 50, but you could add a little bit more. Obviously, the more polys you have, the better your object's going to interact with all of those objects. Just because it's higher in poly, there's more vertices to move around. And then while having this plane selected, I can go over to my FX tab, and I can go over to end cloth to create an end cloth. And then same thing with that collision object we created with all of those merged objects. Rather than creating an end cloth though, I'm just going to create a passive collider. Now at this point, it's just a matter of playing around with those end cloth sliders and settings depending on how I want that end cloth to react with that passive collider. So you can add more gravity, you can add more restrictions depending on however you want that cloth material to look. And just one quick tip, if you're having any issues playing it back and it's just really fast, it's probably your playback speed. So all you have to do is right click your timeline, go to playback speed, and then make sure it's on real time. And that's basically what I did for the next little bit. I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to watch me adjust all these sliders over and over, but I just kept playing around with this end cloth until it fell into a position I was happy with. And once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can just delete history, freeze transformations, and center pivot on that plane object we created for our netting material. And then we can just remove all of that rigid body, nucleus, and all of that out of our outliner. So then we have a clean netting shape that we can add a cool netting material later on in Substance Painter. Now I obviously don't want my netting to go through any of my other objects in my scene, so I'm going to go through with my soft select brush by hitting B on my keyboard, and then I can just adjust my netting mesh so it's not interacting with anything else. Alright, so that's everything I did for the modeling. Now next up I'm going to really quickly show you exactly how I did those UVs. Alright, so here's a model in its finished form. Now what I ended up doing was adding 3 different groups to all of the different textures that were applied to all the objects in the scene. So I broke this thing up into 3 different textures or 3 different groups. So for the very first group, it's boat 1, which consists of the main hull and the main boat shape. The second object is boat 2, which consists of all the other main boat objects, so the floors and all of those frame pieces, as well as that large netting piece. And then the last object was objects, so as you can imagine, it's just all of the rest of the objects that were in the scene. So all the buoys, the paddles, and the life ring. Now I could have easily just combined some of these textures. For example, boat 1 and 2 I probably could have combined into one, especially because they were all wood materials, so it probably would have made sense. But I really wanted to get some nice resolution out of my textures, and this wasn't being used in a video game or anything, so I didn't have any like restrictions to work with, so I thought 3 textures would be fitting, especially because I could use this large area on my UV map for my netting material, so I could make sure that it would look somewhat realistic and it wouldn't look really pixelated or just low in resolution. So that's the reasoning why I did that. And that's exactly how I did those UVs. So now let's just export this so we can jump over to Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Alright, so once that's loaded in, we're just going to do one quick thing. We're going to change our shader. So we're going to go to the top right corner to our shader settings, and I'm going to change that to alpha blending. And the reason is because we want some transparent netting material, we're going to have to add an opacity channel later on. So now that that's all set up, we can go over to our texture set settings, scroll down to bake mesh maps, and I can go choose my output size. I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, and then you can bake out your textures. Alright, so we're going to start off with our hull texture. Just because it's the largest object in the scene, I thought it would be a great place to start. So I found this material on Substance Source website. It's called Natural Painted Wood, and it's a really great material and very fitting for what I had in mind for this object. So that's what we're going to use. Now all I have to do is just change that rotation. Right now they're vertical and we want them running horizontal with our wood panels, and then I can just adjust that color. I was thinking of having like a white painted scratched material on the outside where the hull is, and then a light blue around all of the trim. So let's go ahead and just adjust a few of these colors, and once I'm happy with it, I can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to all of the meshes in the scene. Now I made sure when I was doing the UVing to do some cuts that were right along the center of these wood panels. So rather than doing a polygon fill or a mesh fill and assigning this material to the whole object, I'm going to go to UV chunk fill. That way I can click on just the outside of this hull, and since there's a UV cut directly in the middle, it's only going to assign it to the outside UV piece on this mesh. And that's just because I want to have a different material on the inside of my hull and that white painted material on the outside. And for this lighter blue material I'm using, I'm just reusing that exact same naturally painted wood that I used before, but rather than choosing white, I'm just going to make this one a little bit more blue. Alright, so next up was finding a wood material for the inside of my hull. So I'm just going to go over to my Smart Materials, choose one of those wood Smart Materials that come with Substance Painter, and I can assign that to all of those inside UV chunks on my hull. And like I mentioned earlier, I really didn't know the exact direction I was going with this. I didn't know what materials and colors I wanted to use, so I was just experimenting with a few things, and I decided just to try different wood material on the hull just to see how things would look. Alright, so the inside of my hull is now textured, and I'm not going to be too stuck on trying to get the perfect ideal texture right off the bat. I just want to start filling up all of these empty meshes with materials, and then I can start adjusting things later on. So next up was moving on to our floor texture. So I'm just going to copy over that same blue material we used on this texture, and I can just copy and paste it over to the other one and assign it to all of those floor meshes. I then decided to use a different smart material, some wood material that I can use for all of those wood frames. I wanted that wood color to be a little bit lighter than the wood on my hull, just so there's a little bit of a difference and make the objects pop a little bit more. Alright, so next up was the netting. So I quickly jumped on Substance Source on their website, and I found this car synthetic net that I'd use as my netting material on this boat. Now unfortunately there weren't a lot of options to use. There's a lack of netting materials out there, so rather than creating one from scratch and going down that whole rabbit hole, I decided just to go with this and just to try to make it work. So I just downloaded that, brought it directly into this project, set that as a base material and to the current session, and as you can see there's no transparency. And that's just because we don't have an opacity channel applied. Now at the very beginning we did change our shader, so all we have to do is go over to our texture set settings and scroll down to that little plus icon, and then I can add an opacity channel to my scene. And once you do that, you'll suddenly see this material go see-through, and it actually looks like proper netting. So at this point all I have to do is just change the scale so it's not so large, and just play around with it so it looks a little bit better on that mesh. Alright, so that netting material is applied, and I do come back and change the color of it later on, but for now let's just wrap up this last little object on the very tip of our boat, and to do this I'm just going to use the steel ruin material and apply it to that last mesh. Alright, so next up was our last texture set, all of the objects. So to start this off, I found a rope material once again on the Substance Source website, downloaded that, brought it into my project as a base material, and then I can assign it to all of my ropes in my scene. Now all I have to do is just change that tile, the scale, just to make it fit a little bit better on that mesh, and then once I'm happy I can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to the mesh. And And next up were those little metal pieces that hold the paddles, and I'm just going to reuse that same steel ruined smart material we used earlier, and I can assign it to those meshes as well. Alright, so next up were the paddles, and that's pretty straightforward. I went back to my Smart Materials folder and chose one of those wood materials and applied it to those meshes. Now you may or may not have already noticed that I did add an extra little object in the scene, and I did this right after I did those UVs. I thought adding like a little tackle box, one of those little fishing boxes, would be fitting on a little paddle boat. Now I wanted it kind of hidden in the scene, almost like a little Easter egg, so I just slid it right underneath the bench, underneath the net. Now this is barely visible, and you may have not even noticed it if I didn't bring it up, but I decided to add it into the scene. So next up was that little fishing box, and I decided to keep this relatively simple, just using some of those built-in smart materials that come with Substance. I just applied some of those plastic materials to that mesh. Alright, so next up was that life ring. Now while I was doing those UVs, I made sure to do some cuts in certain areas so I could cut it into 4 different pieces. That way when I apply these materials here in Substance Painter, it just made it much easier for myself. So I'm going to start off with one of those smart materials, just one of those plastic materials, and I can assign it to one of those UV chunks on my life ring. Basically the 2 opposite colors are going to be the same, so I'm going to have 2 red and 2 white, and then I can just assign it to those specific UV pieces. Now the life ring was looking definitely too clean, so I decided to add a fill layer, go over to my masks folder, and I can drag on some masking effect, just to add a little bit of dirt and grunge over top of it. Alright, so next up are those buoys, and same thing, I'm just going to start with one of those smart materials, one of those plastics, and I can just assign it to those meshes. Alright, so now that all of our objects have materials applied, we're going to quickly jump into the render to see how everything's looking. And all I'm going to do here is just remove that background image and then raise that floor height to match with the bottom of my model. And then I can also just mess around with some of the environmental lights, just choose some different lightings to see how they react and how all of those materials are looking. Alright, so now let's jump back into the editor and we can start tweaking a few things. I'm going to start off with just adding a few grunge and dirt effects over top some of these materials, especially that hull, it's looking a little bit too clean, so let's just go and dirty it up a little bit. Alright, so now that the hull's looking a little bit more dirty and it's fitting the scene a little bit more, I just want to create some more worn out spots on all those benches. I'm assuming from people sitting there over and over again, it would wear out some spots where people typically sit. So what I'm going to do is go back to that wood material that we have applied to the hull, and I'm just going to drag that above my painted layer. That way I can go in with a dirt brush and start painting on some worn out areas, so a little bit of wood material starts appearing on those areas that I'd assume would be more worn out. So I'm just going to focus on the middle of those benches and just wear out a few of those areas. Now I spend the next few minutes just tweaking some more grunge and dirt effects on that hull texture, so I'm just going to speed this next portion up, and then we can start adding a few extra details onto our wood. Alright, so next up I just wanted to add a little extra detail, something a little personal to the model to make it look a little bit more realistic, and I thought adding a little engraving into that wood in that back bench would just help bring a little story or background to the model. So I thought making a little engraving in the wood of a little heart with some initials or something would add a little personal touch, so I'm just going to add a fill layer, and I can just turn off some of that color and other channels. All I really need is that height, so I can drag that slider a little bit low so I can have some really nice engravings into that wood material, and then all I have to do is go in and draw onto that wood depending on wherever I want that engraving to go. So let's go ahead and add this tiny little detail onto that rear bench. Alright, so while zooming back out, I noticed how that life ring was looking a little bit too flat, so I wanted to add some little grainy or bump effect into it. So all I'm going to do is add a fill layer and remove most of those channels. All I really need is that height channel, and then I can choose some bumpy or grungy brush, and I can just paint on that bump material directly onto my life ring. Alright, so the boat's slowly coming together and we're almost there. It just needs a little bit more dirt and grunge. It's still looking a little bit too clean, so I'm just going to spend the next few minutes just adding a few more dirt and grunge effects to the model. Now I'm just going to speed this up. It's the exact same process we've been doing. I'm going to add a few fill layers and then drag on whatever masking effect I'd like. Alright, so the boat's looking much better now. It's definitely more dirty, and I thought it'd be cool to add a few words on that life ring. So I just jumped into Photoshop and made myself a quick alpha. I just wrote polyrender and warped the text to curve it a tiny bit so it would fit around that life ring. And I just exported that as a PNG and just threw that into my project as an alpha. So I'm just going to use this to paste on the words polyrender on the top and bottom of my life ring, and then I can go in afterwards with the eraser brush and just mark it up a little bit so the text doesn't look too clean and it fits in with the model. Alright, so the boat's basically finished. I mean, we could wrap up as it is right now, but there's a few small things that jump out at me that I want to fix, and I thought adding a tiny bit more dirt and grunge in certain areas would just help the model look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to spend basically the remaining part of this video just tweaking a few things and adjusting a few colors and settings until I get the model into more of a final state that I'm happy with. So I'm just going to fast forward this last remaining part, and then we can wrap up this old paddle boat model. Alright, so that's basically everything. That is the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this old paddle boat. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Also, if you made it this far in the video, I'm actually curious what color you would have chose for this boat. Let me know in the comments below what 2 colors you would have chose if you had to retexture this model. I ended up choosing blue and white, but I'm really curious what others would have chose, so let me know in the comments. Anyways, thanks so much for tuning into this week's video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.